The clock on the community center wall showed 9:45 p.m. as the last few teens gathered their backpacks after the evening mentorship session. Their youth director, a tall man in his mid-30s with kind eyes and a warm smile, watched them leave with satisfaction. Today's discussion about college applications had gone particularly well, and several students seemed more confident about their futures. He took a moment to straighten the chairs and collect a few forgotten notebooks, making mental notes about tomorrow's agenda. The center's upcoming basketball tournament would need extra volunteers, and he already had some ideas about getting local businesses involved. After double-checking that all the lights were off and the doors were secure, he finally headed to his car, a well-maintained but modest sit-in he'd bought 3 years ago. The night air was cool and crisp, typical for early autumn. Street lights cast long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot as he slid into the driver's seat, placing his laptop bag carefully on the passenger side. His wife had texted earlier about picking up some milk on the way home, so he planned a quick stop at the corner store. The radio played softly, a local jazz station he enjoyed during late drives. As he merged onto the main road, his mind wandered to the young man who'd spoken up during today's session. The kid had seemed worried about affording college application fees, and the youth director had made a note to discuss fee waiver programs with him next week. This was why he loved his job, those small moments where he could make a real difference in someone's journey. Traffic was light at this hour, just a few cars scattered along the 4-lane street. The corner store's neon sign glowed a few blocks ahead when he noticed the police cruiser in his rearview mirror. He wasn't speeding. The cruise control was set exactly at the limit, and his registration and insurance were up to date. Still, years of experience had taught him to be prepared. He turned down the radio and began his usual mental checklist. License in the wallet, registration in the glove compartment, insurance card in the phone app. His seatbelt was on, all lights working. He checked them just yesterday. The youth director kept his driving steady and relaxed, maintaining his speed as the cruiser followed. When the police lights suddenly flashed behind him, he let out a small sigh. He'd been through this before, too many times to count. With practiced calm, he signaled and pulled over to the right, positioning his car well off the road. Interior lights on, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, engine running but car in park. Years of conducting conflict resolution workshops had taught him the importance of staying composed. As he waited for the officer to approach, he thought about his students, about the examples he tried to set for them. Always maintain your dignity, he'd tell them during their discussions about navigating difficult situations. Your response in challenging moments shapes not just your present, but your future. His window was already rolled down when he saw the officer's flashlight beam sweep across his side mirror. The youth director took a slow, steady breath, his documentation ready but still resting untouched on the passenger seat. The approaching footsteps seemed unusually quick and heavy. The night had been going still well. He thought about the milk he was supposed to buy, about his wife probably waiting up for him, despite his texts telling her not to. He thought about the tournament planning he still needed to finish, about the college application workshop tomorrow. Normal things, everyday things, now suspended in this moment of uncertainty. The flashlight beam hit his side mirror again, harsh and bright, and he squinted slightly against the glare. His hands remained steady on the steering wheel, his breathing controlled and even. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same dignity and strength he encouraged in his students. This was more than just another traffic stop. It was a moment that would test everything he taught about keeping your composure when facing injustice. The officer's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, moving erratically across the car's interior. Something felt different about this stop. There was none of the usual professional distance, no standard license and registration request. Instead, the officer's voice came sharp and loud through the open window. "Get out of the vehicle. Now." The youth director kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his voice steady despite the unexpected command. "Good evening, officer." May I ask why I am being stopped? I said get out. The officer's hand was already on his holster, his stance aggressive. Don't make me tell you again. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on the youth director. Just hours ago, he'd been leading a workshop on maintaining composure under pressure. And now here he was, living those very lessons. His heart raced, but his voice remained calm. Officer, I'd like to comply, but I need to understand the reason for this stop. I have my license and registration right here. Through the side mirror, he could see the officer's face twist with frustration. The flashlight beam jerked wildly across the car's interior again, as if searching for something, anything, to justify the stop. You made an illegal lane change back there, the officer claimed, though both men knew this wasn't true. Sir, I've been driving straight in this lane for the past 10 minutes, the youth director replied evenly. My dashboard camera has been recording my entire drive. This wasn't strictly true. He didn't have a camera, but experience had taught him that sometimes the mere suggestion of documentation could help de-escalate a situation. The officer stepped back slightly, his hand still on his holster. Turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. This is your final warning. The youth director's mind raced through his options. He knew his rights. He'd studied them, taught them, lived them. But he also knew that rights on paper didn't always translate to safety in reality. His fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel as he made his decision. Officer, I want to cooperate fully, he said clearly, his voice steady and professional. But I don't feel safe exiting my vehicle without understanding the reason for this stop. I'd like to request a supervisor, please. A car passed by slowly, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene. The youth director noticed the driver slow down, probably sensing the tension in the air. In that brief flash of light, he caught sight of the officer's nameplate and badge number, committing them to memory. You don't get to make demands, the officer snapped, but there was a new note of uncertainty in his voice. Maybe it was the passing car, maybe it was the youth director's composed demeanor, or maybe it was the mention of a supervisor. Whatever the reason, something had shifted. The youth director thought about his students again. Tomorrow, they'd ask him how his evening went, just like they always did. What story would he tell them? What lesson would they learn from this moment? He'd always taught them that dignity was non-negotiable, that staying true to your principles mattered most when it was hardest to do so. Officer, he tried again, his tone respectful but firm. I understand you're doing your job. I'm simply asking for transparency about why I've been stopped. I have the right to know that, and I have the right to feel safe during this interaction. I'm happy to provide my documentation and cooperate fully, but I need to understand what's happening here. Another car slowed as it passed, then another. The officer glanced around, seemingly becoming aware of the attention they were drawing. The youth director remained still, hands visible, voice steady. He'd been in similar situations before, had experienced the same rush of adrenaline, the same need to stay calm, while every instinct screamed at him to react differently. In the distance, another set of police lights appeared. The youth director wasn't sure if the officer had called for backup or if a patrol car had just happened to pass by, but he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. More officers could mean more witnesses, more accountability, or more complications. Either way, he knew the next few minutes would be crucial. The youth director's phone lay face down on the passenger seat, quietly recording audio of the entire interaction. He'd started this habit months ago, not out of paranoia but preparedness. Now, as the second patrol car approached, he was grateful for that decision. His mind flashed back to last week's community meeting where they discussed proper documentation of police encounters. Your phone is your witness, one of the older community members had said. But it's how you act that tells the true story. Those words echoed in his head as he watched the new patrol car park at an angle in his rearview mirror. The first officer was still standing by his window, tension visible in every line of his body. Last chance, he said, his voice tight. "Get out now, or is there a problem here?" A new voice cut through the night air. The youth director could see a second officer approaching, their pace measured and professional. Unlike the first officer, this one kept their hands visible and maintained a reasonable distance. "Routine traffic stop," the first officer replied, his tone shifting slightly. "Drivers being uncooperative." The youth director seized this moment to speak, keeping his voice clear and steady. "Good evening, officer. I've been requesting to know the reason for this stop. I have my license and registration ready, but I've been ordered out of my vehicle without explanation. I'd like to cooperate fully, but I also want to ensure my rights are respected." The new officer paused, taking in the scene. More cars were slowing down now, creating an audience of silent witnesses. The street lights cast long shadows across the pavement, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, breaking the tension momentarily. "Sir, can you tell me where you're coming from?" the second officer asked, their tone professional but not confrontational. "I'm heading home from the community center on Oak Street," he replied. "I'm the youth director there. I was just finishing up an evening mentorship session." He noticed how the first officer shifted uncomfortably at the mention of his profession. The second officer nodded. "I know the center. You folks did that career fair last month, right?" "Yes, that's right. We had over 30 local businesses participate." He kept his hands on the steering wheel as he spoke, maintaining the same calm demeanor he'd held since the start of this encounter. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk across the street. The youth director could see people holding up phones, their camera lights tiny beacons in the darkness. He thought about how quickly things could escalate or de-escalate, how each word and action could tip the scales one way or the other. The first officer's radio crackled to life. "Dispatch requesting a status update." As he stepped away to respond, the second officer moved closer to the car window, speaking in a lower voice. "Sir, I understand you're concerned. Would you be willing to show me your license and registration while my colleague runs your information?" "Of course," he replied, slowly reaching for the documents he already prepared. "I just want to be clear. Am I being detained? And if so, what is the reason?" The question hung in the air for a moment. In the distance, he could hear more sirens approaching. His phone kept recording, capturing every word, every pause, every subtle shift in the atmosphere. He thought about the teens he mentored, about how many of them had shared similar stories of unexplained stops, of fear masked as compliance, of dignity under pressure. The gathering crowd had grown larger, their presence both a comfort and a concern. He didn't want this situation to escalate, didn't want to become another viral video, another statistic. But he also knew that sometimes the most powerful resistance was simply standing firm in your rights, staying calm in the face of injustice. As he handed over his documentation, he noticed the first officer returning, his posture slightly different now. Perhaps it was the crowd of witnesses, the recording phones, or simply the presence of his colleague, but something had changed in the dynamic of this encounter. The night air felt charged with possibility. This moment could still go many different ways. Among the growing crowd of onlookers, a young woman in business attire stepped forward, phone steady in her hands. She'd been walking to her car after a late night at the law firm where she worked as a first-year associate when she noticed the confrontation. Now she stood at a safe distance, clearly recording while speaking into her phone, documenting the time, location, and what she was witnessing. The youth director noticed her professional demeanor in his side mirror. He could hear her clear, steady voice carrying across the quiet street. "I'm observing what appears to be an unlawful detention. The driver is clearly cooperating while asserting his rights. Multiple officers are now on scene." More patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the street in rotating colors of red and blue. Among them was a higher-ranking officer. The youth director could tell by the different insignia visible under the streetlights. As this officer approached, the atmosphere shifted subtly. "What's the situation here?" the ranking officer asked, her voice carrying natural authority. The youth director recognized her from community outreach meetings. She'd attended several events at the center over the past year. The first officer started to speak, but the young lawyer cut in, her voice professional and composed. "Ma'am, I've been recording this interaction for the past 8 minutes. The driver has been cooperative while repeatedly requesting the reason for the stop. He's been threatened with forced removal from his vehicle without probable cause." The ranking officer turned toward the car, recognition flickering across her face. "Sir, aren't you the director from the youth center?" she asked, moving closer while keeping a respectful distance. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, hands still visible on the steering wheel. "I was heading home from our evening mentorship program when I was stopped." The first officer shifted uncomfortably as the ranking officer turned to him. What was the reason for the stop? The silence that followed spoke volumes. The gathered crowd had grown quieter, everyone straining to hear the exchange. The young lawyer continued recording, her steady hand capturing every moment. "I thought I saw an illegal lane change," the first officer finally said, his voice less certain now. But what?" the ranking officer prompted, her tone professional but firm. "I may have been mistaken," he admitted reluctantly. The youth director took a slow, deep breath. He thought about how this moment could be used for positive change rather than division. "Ma'am," he said, addressing the ranking officer, "I'd be happy to discuss this incident at next week's community relations meeting. Perhaps we could use it as a learning opportunity for both officers and residents." The crowd murmured with approval. Someone had started streaming the interaction live, and comments of support were flowing in from across the city. The young lawyer stepped forward again, her legal pad now in hand along with her phone. "I'd be willing to attend that meeting as well," she offered, "to provide an independent witness account and discuss citizens' rights during traffic stops." The ranking officer nodded thoughtfully, then turned to the first officer. "We'll discuss this incident in detail back at the station." To the youth director, she said, "Sir, you're free to go. I apologize for any inconvenience, and I look forward to our discussion at next week's meeting." As the crowd began to disperse, the young lawyer approached the driver's window, keeping a respectful distance. "I have all of this documented," she said quietly, "including the initial approach and demands. Would you like me to send you the recordings?" The youth director thought about his students again, about the lessons they could learn from this night. Not just about standing up for their rights, but about how community support and professional allies could transform a potentially dangerous situation into an opportunity for change. Back in his car, driving the final stretch home, the youth director's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, the first outward sign of the stress he'd been holding in. The corner store, where he was supposed to buy milk, had closed 30 minutes ago. His phone buzzed with messages from concerned community members who'd seen the live stream of the incident. The ranking officer had insisted on escorting him home, her patrol car following at a respectful distance. It wasn't necessary, but he understood the gesture, both as protection and as a sign of accountability. In his rearview mirror, he could see the young lawyer following as well, having offered to provide a written statement about what she'd witnessed. When he pulled into his driveway, his wife was already at the door, worry etched on her face. She'd seen the live stream too. The porch light cast a warm glow as he stepped out of his car, legs feeling surprisingly weak now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "I'm okay," he said before she could ask, pulling her into a tight hug. It turned out different this time. The community was there. The ranking officer parked across the street, approaching with a business card in hand. "I've already started the paperwork for an internal review," she said. "Your presence at next week's meeting would be valuable, if you're willing." The young lawyer had parked too, her legal pad filled with detailed notes. "I've got timestamps, badge numbers, and a full recording," she offered, plus dozens of witnesses willing to provide statements. This could help create real change in department policies. His wife squeezed his hand, and he felt the tension in his shoulders start to ease. Let's do this right, he said. Not just for me, but for every person who's been through something similar without witnesses or support. Inside their home, sitting at the kitchen table with cups of tea, they began to plan. The young lawyer outlined potential policy changes that could be proposed. The ranking officer, who'd been invited in briefly, shared insights about current training procedures and where improvements could be made. The youth center could host a series of workshops, he suggested, his professional instincts kicking in. Bring in officers and community members, especially young people. Let them talk in a safe space, learn from each other. His phone kept buzzing. Community leaders, local activists, even some parents of his students had seen the video. But these weren't messages of anger or calls for protest. Instead, they offered support, resources, and ideas for turning this incident into an opportunity for positive change. The young lawyer was already drafting a proposal for new police training protocols. We need to address the root causes, she explained. Better training on de-escalation, implicit bias, community relations, and clear consequences when officers don't follow proper procedures. His wife brought out a notebook, starting to write down action items. Years of organizing community programs had taught them both that real change required more than just good intentions. It needed structure, planning, and follow-through. The ranking officer had to leave for her shift, but her parting words stuck with him. What happened tonight was wrong. But how we respond to it, that's what matters now. Later, alone in their kitchen, his wife asked the question he'd been avoiding. Are you really okay? He thought carefully before answering. The fear, the anger, the humiliation, those feelings were real. But so was the hope he'd felt seeing the community come together, witnessing professionals like the lawyer and the ranking officer step up to help create change. I'm better than okay, he finally said. Tonight showed me something important. When we stand up for what's right, when we stay professional and focused on solutions, people listen. Real change becomes possible. His phone buzzed again. A message from one of his students who'd seen the video. You showed us how to handle it. You didn't just teach us about dignity, you lived it. The community center was packed the following evening. People stood along the walls, sat cross-legged on the floor, and spilled out into the hallway. The youth director stood at the front of the room, his usual confident stance unchanged despite the events of the previous night. What had started as a regular community meeting had transformed into something much more significant. We're not here to point fingers, he began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. We're here to create solutions. The crowd, a mix of local residents, police officers, and community leaders, listened intently. The young lawyer from the previous night sat in the front row, her laptop open and ready. The ranking officer from last night's incident stood beside him, her presence sending a clear message about police willingness to engage in dialogue. What happened last night was unacceptable, she stated plainly, but it's also an opportunity for real change. They had spent the morning reviewing the video footage not just from phones, but from nearby security cameras that business owners had voluntarily provided. The evidence was clear, but what mattered now was the response. The youth director clicked to the first slide of his presentation. Here's what we're proposing, he said, outlining a comprehensive plan that had come together in the early hours of the morning. First, a series of workshops where officers and community members can learn from each other. Not just talking, really listening. A teenage girl raised her hand. But how do we know they'll actually listen? The question carried the weight of countless similar experiences, countless similar fears. Because we're making this official, the young lawyer stepped in, standing to address the crowd. We're drafting policy proposals that will require regular community engagement, enhanced training, and real accountability measures. The youth director nodded, clicking to the next slide. We're also expanding our youth program. Every teenager in this community should know their rights, but also understand how to safely interact with law enforcement. And we want officers involved in this education, not as authority figures, but as partners in learning. A police officer in the back, who'd been quietly taking notes, raised his hand. "I'd volunteer for that," he said. "A lot of us would. We need this too." The energy in the room shifted as more people began to engage. A local business owner offered her shop as a neutral meeting space. A retired judge volunteered to help review the policy proposals. Parents stepped up to organize transportation for youth workshops. "This isn't just about one incident," the youth director continued, his voice growing passionate but controlled. "It's about creating a community where everyone feels safe, where dignity is the default, where we solve problems together." The young lawyer projected some statistics on the screen, numbers that showed the impact of community police partnerships in other cities. "This works," she emphasized. "When we combine proper training, accountability, and community engagement, we see real results." An older community member stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. "I've been fighting for these changes for 50 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But this time feels different. This time we have evidence, we have professionals on our side, and we have a plan." The ranking officer stepped forward again. "Changes are already in motion," she announced. "As of this morning, new protocols are being implemented for traffic stops. Body cameras must be activated, reason for stops must be clearly stated, and supervisors must be called when requested." The youth director looked around the room, seeing hope mixed with determination on faces young and old. His students were scattered throughout the crowd, watching intently, learning a different kind of lesson than usual. This wasn't just about handling a bad situation. It was about transforming it into positive change. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start the real work. Training sessions, policy reviews, community dialogues. But tonight, I'd want everyone to recognize what's happening here. We're not just talking about change. We're creating it, together, right now in this room." 3 months after that night, the youth director stood at the back of the police academy's training room, watching as his students led a workshop on community perspectives. The room was filled with both veteran officers and new recruits, all paying close attention as teenagers shared their experiences and hopes for the future. Before all this, one student explained, gesturing to the presentation behind her, "I was scared every time I saw a police car in my neighborhood. Now I know some of these officers by name. We play basketball together at the community center." The young lawyer sat nearby, taking notes on the implementation of their new training protocols. What had started as a proposal was now official department policy, with measurable results already showing. Traffic stop complaints had dropped by 40% in just the first 2 months. The key was making it personal, the youth director explained to a visiting official from another district. When officers and community members actually talk to each other, share meals together, learn about each other's lives, that's when real change happens. The first officer from that night was there too, though in a different role now. After facing disciplinary action, he'd chosen to participate in the new training program. Today, he was sharing his own story of how the incident had changed his perspective. "I thought I was doing my job," he admitted to the room. "But I was letting assumptions and fear drive my actions. This program showed me a better way to serve and protect our community." The ranking officer, now promoted to captain, stepped forward to share the department's latest statistics. Response times had improved, community trust ratings were up, and officer job satisfaction had increased. But more importantly, there were stories behind those numbers, real changes in how police and residents interacted. A group of elementary school students had started a High Five a Hero program, greeting officers who visited their school. Local businesses had created community connection spots where officers could stop for coffee and conversation with residents. The youth center had become a hub for police community activities, from basketball games to cooking classes. "Remember when we could barely get 5 people to attend a community police meeting?" the youth director asked during his presentation. "Now we have waiting lists." He clicked to a photo of last week's community dinner, where officers and residents had shared meals and stories at mixed tables. The young lawyer stood to present the legal impact of their changes. Other districts were now requesting their training materials and policy guidelines. The state legislature was considering adopting similar measures statewide. What had started as one incident was spreading, creating ripples of change across the region. But the most important changes, she noted, are the ones we see every day on our streets. She played a recent dashcam video showing a traffic stop under the new protocols. The officer was professional and clear, the driver was informed of their rights, and the entire interaction was respectful and transparent. It was exactly how things should be, how they could be when proper training and accountability measures were in place. The youth director thought back to that night 3 months ago, to the fear and tension he felt. Now, watching his students teach police officers about community perspectives, he saw how that moment had become a catalyst for real change. One of his younger students was demonstrating their new traffic stop app, a tool that helped both officers and civilians understand their rights and responsibilities during interactions. The app had been her idea, born from discussions about how to make legal information more accessible to everyone. The best solutions, the youth director told the visiting official, come from the community itself. Our job is just to create the space where those ideas can grow. As the session ended, officers and students mingled, exchanging contact information and making plans for upcoming community events. The boundaries that had once seemed so rigid were softening, replaced by genuine connections and mutual understanding. 1 year had passed since that night by the corner store. The youth director stood on a small stage in the community center's main hall, looking out at a crowd that would have seemed impossible 12 months ago. Police officers sat next to teenagers, city officials alongside community activists, all gathered to celebrate the anniversary of their transformation. The walls were covered with photos documenting their journey, community meetings, training sessions, basketball games, and shared meals. A large screen showed statistics that told part of the story. Complaints down 70%, community trust up 80%, and police job satisfaction at an all-time high. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The youth director began, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. The real change is in the everyday moments. He gestured to a young officer in the front row. Like when Officer Chen here coached our youth basketball team to the city finals. The crowd chuckled as the officer raised his hand, showing off the second-place trophy the team had won. Next to him, his players beamed with pride, not just in their achievement, but in the relationship they'd built with their coach. Or when Mrs. Washington's car broke down at midnight, he continued, nodding to an elderly woman in the audience. And 3 officers not only helped her get home safely, but came back the next day to fix her car. The young lawyer stood up next, her laptop displaying the program's newest achievement, state-level adoption of their training protocols. What started in this room has spread to 30 other cities, she announced. But more importantly, it's changed how we see each other. The ranking officer, now deputy chief, stepped forward with an unexpected announcement. Starting next month, our academy training will include a full week at the community center. New officers will learn directly from the people they'll serve before they ever put on a badge. A teenager raised her hand to share her story. Last week, I got pulled over for a broken taillight, she said. But instead of being scared, I knew exactly what to expect. The officer was professional, explained everything clearly, and even showed me how to replace the light myself. The youth director smiled, remembering how different his own traffic stop had been a year ago. That's what real change looks like, he said. Not just new policies, but new relationships. Not just better training, but better understanding. He clicked to a new slide showing their latest initiative, a youth police academy designed and led by teenagers. Our students aren't just participating in change anymore, he explained. They're leading it. The first officer from that night stood up to speak. His journey had become a powerful example of transformation. A year ago, I was part of the problem, he admitted. Now, I train other officers on how to do better, and every day I learn something new from this community. The young lawyer shared clips from their latest training videos, real situations handled with respect and professionalism on both sides. These aren't just examples, she explained. These are our new normal. A small group of children ran up to the stage, wearing t-shirts they designed for the anniversary. The shirts show the simple but powerful image. Diverse hands joined in a circle, with the words, "Community Strong," beneath. This is what we build together, the youth director concluded, his voice full of pride and hope. Not perfect, but better. Not finished, but moving forward. Every traffic stop that ends with a handshake instead of handcuffs. Every teenager who sees an officer as a mentor instead of a threat. Every officer who feels connected to the community they serve. These are the victories we celebrate today. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't just celebration. It was recognition of how far they'd come, and commitment to how far they could still go. As people stood to mingle and share stories, the youth director watched officers and residents embracing, teenagers teaching new protocols to academy recruits, and community leaders planning next year's initiatives. His phone buzzed with a message, another city requesting their training program. He smiled, remembering how one difficult night had sparked a movement that continued to grow, one relationship at a time.